cloud. So, welcome to all our colleagues, students, guests, and especially our speaker, Talia Lubinsky, beaming in from Berlin, Germany. The Spiral series is programmed by me, Dwayne Jethro, the Junior Research Fellow at the Center for Curating the Archive, which is located at the Michaelis School of Fine Art at the University of Cape Town. I'm assisted by Nina Liebenberg, a PhD candidate here at the center, who is also our co-host of the session, and she'll be joining us shortly once again. By way of introduction, the CCA has worked actively with different kinds of collections to develop curatorship as a site of knowledge production. Archival and curatorial practice are core research activities of our work, both the conservation of collections and for making them accessible to artists, scholars, and students. Projects, publications, and courses run through the CCA aim to open up novel combinations of the historically separated domains of the creative arts and the truth-claiming discourses of history and the social and natural sciences. The series therefore draws on the CCA's long-standing interest in the nature of archive and its intersections with the curatorial as a programmed set of conversations about conceptions, configurations, and the representations of art, the curatorial, and the archival. The title Spirals is as peculiar as it is purposeful. Peculiar because it is a metaphor of fierce, perhaps even destructive circulation. Purposeful in that it is the possibilities of disorder, but also renewal presented by such a metaphor that we find especially productive. The spiral, therefore, provides the possibility for conceptually sweeping across the linearities that structure our basic assumptions about archive, art, the academy, and the curatorial. As a space of circulation, these conversations are a site of sharing perspectives on crucial yet common questions about the nature of archive and the practice and work of the curatorial. We convene in virtual space online between Berlin and Cape Town. This has been made possible in part due to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic that has upended our personal lives, our relationships, our professional worlds. It is important to stress that we want to abandon with the assumption that our speakers are coming in and conveying lessons, as if the scholarly, artistic, and curatorial work being done in Berlin is at a vanguard that those in the global south should passively absorb. Certainly, Berlin is a major global hub of artistic and scholarly work, but in many ways, so too is Cape Town, South Africa, and the African continent more generally. These conversations are meant to enrich our perspectives here at the University of Cape Town and to challenge those of our speakers and to contribute to them thinking differently. We therefore meet as a community of learning with different views brought to bear on a shared set of questions about the nature of archive, artistic practice, and the curatorial, and the assumed stakes and investments that attach to those. This session is titled Post-Preservation, and in it we consider alternate ontologies of matter, materiality, and vitality, and explore the sometimes unsettling implications thereof for notions of archive, life, and commemorations. We are humbled to have Talia Lubinsky as our speaker today. Talia is an artist from Johannesburg, currently based in Berlin. Between 2019 and 2020, she was awarded a one-year residency at the Künstlerhaus Britannien in Berlin, funded by the KfW Stiftung. Solo exhibitions include Marble Dust at the Künstlerhaus Britannien, Berlin, Floating Bodies at the Eva-Lever-Haus, Bayreuth in Germany, and If We Burn, There Is Ash at the Wits Anthropology Museum in Johannesburg. Lubinsky received an MFA with distinction from Wits University, Johannesburg, and is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of the Western Cape Town, based at the Center for Humanities Research. She is a recipient of an Andrew W. Mellon Center for Humanities Research flagship doctoral fellowship. Talia's talk is titled Permanence, Decay, and the Politics of Post-Preservation. She will discuss her exhibition Marble Dust as a way of considering the politics and poetics of disintegration and decay in reconfiguring our approaches to heritage management. The exhibition focuses on a particular cemetery archive in Mamelodi, South Africa, as a node for investigating what is at stake when the ostensible durability of stone memorials is placed in tension with the ephemerality of disintegrating paper and indeed disintegrating bones. I will be the discussant for today's session. Friends, colleagues, Zoom fatigue is weighing on all of us, so we would like to keep the tone casual, easy, and accessible. Please keep cameras off during the presentation, raise your hands for questions, or post them in the chat box for us to gather. It would be great if you identified yourself when up on screen. Thank you so much. And Talia, now I would like to thank you once again and hand over the floor to you for your presentation. We are very much looking forward and really happy that you're here today.
Thank you, Dwayne. It's so wonderful to be here and to see some familiar names in the chat. I hope to see your faces and get to answer some questions and have a conversation after the presentation. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I have to apologize. I'm not on my own computer, so it's going to take a moment to get everything, like, it's not all as slick as I would have liked. So I'm going to start by showing some exhibition shots from the exhibition we're talking about, which took place in January of 2020. If you can give me one moment to start sharing my screen. Can you see? You can see my screen now. Cool. I'm just going to make it full screen. Okay. So it's a bit funny to start in a way with the final product, but I'll start here, and then once I've given you a sense of what the exhibition looked like, I'll give you a bit of background information about the project, and then go into more kind of theoretical considerations, like what Dwayne alluded to in the beginning. So what you see here are a series of marble stone plaques that were hand carved by me into the shapes of just integrating paper from the Mamelodi Cemetery archive. And they've all been placed on these shelves that have a kind of, on one hand, they play the role of a kind of traditional plinth, what you would use to show sculpture in a gallery or a museum, but they also have this institutional kind of look, which is, you know, something you expect to see in an archive or a kind of state institution. So now that you've got a little bit of it, yeah, this is an idea of what the show looked like. I'm going to just show a few pages from the catalog, which give a bit of background information. Just going to have to go back to stop sharing for a moment. Okay, so you can see on the right-hand side, there's the picture of what the offices of the Mamelodi Cemetery look like. They're really in a mess. And the pages from these old ledger books are, some of them are still within the books themselves, some are lying in heaps on the ground. And so this was like one of my first interactions with the space of the cemetery. and these are still the same records that are used daily by the staff who work at the cemetery to find out things like where people are buried, what year they were buried, where the graves can be found, etc. So the reason I came to be at this site in the first place was that the Missing Persons Task Team, which is a group of people who work towards finding or searching for missing persons who died or were killed under political circumstances from the 1960s to the 1990s in South Africa. So they are a team headed by Madeleine Fullard, and they've worked on a number of very important cases in South Africa. And from 2018, no, before that, but in 2018, they were busy working on a project which was exhuming the bones of political prisoners who had been killed for treason by the apartheid state in the early 1960s. And when I kind of started working with them, they were busy holding exhumation ceremonies with the families of the deceased. And so what you see on the right-hand side is a picture. And so the people who were the bones of the political prisoners who were being exhumed had been buried in the Mamelodi Cemetery, which is what brought me there in the first place. And what you see here is a picture from one of the exhumations. I'm going to just skip through that one. So the political prisoners were buried by the apartheid state as paupers, so they had no gravestones, and they were buried three bodies on top of each other. And the bodies had remained in the custody of the state up until, a few years ago when they were given back to the families for them to then bury in different parts of the country in their ancestral land with proper burial rites. And this is just a page. We had to kind of blur the names out, but this is what the actual ledger books looked like. And just to clarify something, these ledger books that are kind of lying around in the offices of the cemetery are just the normal kind of archive of that cemetery. So it's not only recording the deaths and burial places of the political prisoners, but it's like a huge cemetery that's been, functioning for decades, and it's a place where normal people are buried. This is just one of the very many specimens you might find in the offices of the Missing Person Task Team. And it's some bones. And I'll just read a short extract here from Madeleine Fullard, who's in the process of writing basically a book about her experiences, but of working with the Missing Persons Task Team. But this was a short extract that was published in 2018 in the Kronos journal. She wrote, the erosion of his umber bones, their edges perpetually softening, is slowly bringing him closer in appearance and substance to the roots and soil we plucked him from. Decomposition returns us to our affinities with flora and fauna. He is becoming earth, journeying from human to dust. His corporeal compounds are reverting to their original simple substances, salts, minerals, proteins, and phosphates, the constitution of life disassembling back to earth. So as you'll see as I get further on in the talk, I'm really interested in the relationship between decay or decomposition and permanence. And I think that what this case study or this site of the exhumations at the Mamelodi Cemetery really made apparent was that there was this, on one hand, there was a kind of process of disintegration of the bones, which I landed up making a parallel between the bones and the paper that was disintegrating in the archive, and then the permanence or the supposed permanence of the tombstone, which is the thing, which is the memorial, the thing that's supposed to be heavy, permanent, but at the same time, the absence of that memorial, because these specific burials were not memorialized. They did not have tombstones. So this is the kind of terrain in which I'm working. And then another thing we can maybe get back to at the end is just to put it into context a little bit of the place in which I made the exhibition. And that was in Berlin, as Dwayne mentioned. And I was kind of inspired by a cemetery very close to where I live, where they had been clearing the ground for a new, like a community garden to be built or to be planted, let's say. And so they were clearing away all the old gravestones in the cemetery. And still today, actually, when I look outside my window, I can see these piles of gravestones lying around in what used to be a cemetery. So it kind of made me think about what we think of as permanent, and what kind of values we give to the idea of a kind of permanent memorial. So, and then I guess the thing that what I want to actually speak about is the idea, as Dwayne's mentioned, of post-preservation. And this just really means, it just, for me, is it's a term I read about through Caitlin De Silva in her book, which I actually have here, that's why I'm looking at it, Curated Decay. And it's basically a theory that says that the kind of physical breakdown of sites of heritage, whether that's archives or museums or other like sites that are outside, not inside institutions, the processes of decay that they are subject to just because of the fact of being part of the natural world can be something that, rather than something that we kind of fight against usually in our like general approach to heritage management, let's say conservation, etc., that through a kind of embracing of that process, we can actually bring to bear like meanings that have to do with the way that objects change throughout time. And so we'll get to that later. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Sorry. Just need to figure out, okay, stop share. Okay, cool. All right, so I've given you a little bit of a background to the project, and so it's just to say that the disintegrating bones were a way of talking about the like the materiality of them was a way of talking about on one hand, the impossibility of restitution or a full kind of return, because of course these people's lives were lost and their bodies and their lives can never be regained. But at the same time, the act of giving back the bones is this really important symbolic gesture. And so I felt that the fact that the bones were kind of crumbling and almost becoming one with the earth was a really interesting way for thinking through the conditions of return, because it's always indexing loss and absence. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about like my process in making the work, and it was something that was always a little bit uneasy as a white South African to be telling the stories of Black South Africans who died who were killed in the most violent of ways at the hands of the apartheid state. And I'm just going to read something that was written by a scholar, Nena Anuoa, who wrote she wrote a article for my catalogue, and we had kind of had a conversation about it, and so this was her kind of contribution to that conversation. So she wrote, "Only the outlines of these archival papers have been carved into stone, leaving out any textual information that they may have held. Lubinski's work is not necessarily concerned with telling the specific stories of these Black activists chronicled within the archive. It purposefully shies away from presenting viewers with concrete information, instead inviting us to consider broader connections between what fades to dust and what endures through time, provoking more general meditations on the notion of permanence and decay that such histories bring into play. The decision to focus on the more generalized themes that emerge from considering the archive, rather than the specific lived experiences of those chronicled within it, is not beyond reproach. On some levels, abstracting this particular history of violence in this way could be critiqued as at best instrumentalizing and appropriating an already suppressed account of the past, and at worst, continuing its erasure. Lubinski recognizes this and said that abstraction for her creates a way for her as a white South African to speak about this history that is not hers, but without any pretense about speaking for or giving voice to those involved. So anyway, I have a longer piece, but I think I won't continue reading the whole thing. So I guess, so this is the question of abstraction and what that does. On one hand, it allows for a kind of universalizing approach to the material, but on the other hand, it may serve to erase the particular narrative and the particular story of what I'm talking about. And I think that the work sits inside that tension and isn't ever really, that's not really resolved. And I think I'm okay with that not being resolved. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the stones, the marble stones, and to what I found interesting when working with them was that when I was carving the stones themselves, I was using an angle grinder, and the smell, what comes when you kind of open up a piece of marble with whatever, if you're using a chisel or you're using what I was using, which is an electric tool, there's actually like a sulfurish smell that comes out of it. And this is because the kind of geological composition of marble is made up of sea creatures, which is basically calcium. So it's the shells of sea creatures that have been compacted over time with heat, the way the earth does its thing, and over, you know, many millennia becomes compacted into rock, into stone. And I found that this was like quite a interesting moment when you start to carve into these rocks, and the sulfur that gets released from the stone is actually like the living beings that have been ossified in that stone. And so I was interested in also breaking this binary, which places stone as a necessarily like inert or even dead. You know, it's like the ultimate expression of like a stone, like something that's not alive. And actually, I was interested in looking at it as something that is alive. And that's why I was also interested in evoking the idea of dust, partly because just making the sculpture made so much dust while I was like carving, but of course it has that, the dust has that quality of being, you know, really ephemeral, but also of the material that is also very permanent and heavy. Dwayne, how much time do I still have? Sorry.
You can take like maybe 5 minutes more,
Okay,
if you have
cool.
a couple points you want to make.
Perfect. So I just wanted to read, because we've centered, the reason I wanted to center this, center this idea of post-preservation is that I thought that it could be a nice like framing for the conversation, as this is a group of people who are all concerned with archive and archival practices. So I was just going to read a quick quote from Curated Decay. The disintegration of structural integrity does not necessarily lead to the evacuation of meaning. Processes of decay and disintegration can be culturally as well as ecologically productive. And in certain contexts, it is possible to look beyond loss to conceive other ways of understanding and acknowledging material change. And I think what I also appreciate about this lens into looking at, you know, questions of preservation and conservation, etc., is that it's also critical of the sometimes, or the often, paternalistic and even colonial approaches that institutions or custodians of heritage play, because there is a way in which I've got just, well, maybe not necessarily a quote, but there's a way in which the custodians who care for objects obviously have power over them, and I'm trying to also call into question if those kinds of gestures of care that take objects out of the kind of natural circulation of the world, if that's always necessarily a benevolent kind of care. And I think it's kind of obvious that it's not from what we've seen in the way in which, you know, colonial collections were made and why they were made, etc. I don't need to, I think that's like a common ground we probably all agree upon. So yeah, so I'm interested in also what the idea of decay does for the permeability between subject and object. Of course, in the example of the disintegrating body, I think that's quite a powerful example of that. I mean, in permeability, let's say. And I think that that can be an interesting frame from which to think about destabilizing colonial regimes of classificatory knowledge, which is another reason why I'm interested in like using this framework. But maybe we should just move on to questions. Like there's more to talk about, but I would be really interested to hear from Dwayne and to hear from the rest of you. And I hope I've given enough context from which to have a meaningful conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Talia. Thank you for your presentation and for giving us some context and to providing some like conceptual substance to what is seemingly an unassuming exhibition. There's a lot going on in your exhibition. It challenges you on many levels. I've been wanting to have this chat with you ever since I saw the exhibition on opening night, on that busy opening night at Kunsthaus Bethanien. And we've been having these chats for quite some time already about decay, ruins, ruination, relationships between materiality, human body, etc. So I was struck by the relationships your exhibition sets up between bodies, archives, and commemorations. I think that's your exhibition is a meditation on the relationships between these things, right? Bodies, archives, commemorative forms, commemorations, and I'm wondering about the way in which you're thinking about this as being a search for the locus of permanence. So where is the locus of permanence actually lying? I don't know. Does that resonate with you as something that was percolating in your mind when you were thinking about the exhibition?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm actually, I'm going to go off script here. We had already planned some question and answers, but I'm going to go just with something else that comes to mind.
No problem.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because I think of like my approach to trying to understand archives and collections as being quite anti-permanence, let's say. But then I go and then I made it, but then I went and like made some marble sculptures, you know, which are like basically the epitome of ideas of permanence. And not only in, not only because marble and stone is the material from which tombstones are made, but also in relation to the history of art. There's like this obvious tradition of high art, let's say, things that are really precious being made out of marble. So I mean, of course, I'm interested in that tension in what is what can be perceived, what is, I think the way you phrased it is like the locus of permanence. But I think that something that I've come to think about more, and I think that this is part of the kind of current debates around restitution that's happening in the world, is what would, like, in a way, what I keep on going back to the idea of decay or like disintegration, because I think it's like this bridging point between a kind of heritage museum practice that is completely, let's say, without objects, which is something that there are calls for, which are, or there's a kind of stream of thought which says, what are we doing? These objects are already laden with so much colonial baggage. Why are we holding on to them? And then another stream of thought, which is like, these objects are really important. And I mean, at the very least, they can be returned to where they were stolen from. And I think that what comes into question now is how do we index or like speak about the meaning of those objects that are now eventually being returned and will continue to be returned to the continent. And this isn't only to do with, obviously museum objects. We've seen it with human remains that have been returned from Germany to Namibia, for example. But even in the case of the Missing Persons Task Team, I just keep on going back to the fact that like the bones are there and not there. Like they do that work, of indexing loss because they're half gone in the first place. And I just think that for me, that's such a rich space to work with, and it keeps on allowing me to continue to like work with that as a metaphor or as a productive space of meaning, let's say. Maybe that doesn't answer your question, but let's keep going.
I like the leap that you're making from a specific set of cases, right? Like your exhibition was inspired by observations that you had at Mamelodi Cemetery, and this pile of material of these paupers records and the cemetery in Berlin. Like there were very concrete examples and observations, and you were there, like you were in these places, these things, and the exhibition is a materialization of these observations and the things that you're thinking of. But now you're developing a set of concepts that can be applied in other contexts, and that I find really interesting. And what particularly struck me about your exhibition is the way in which it materializes a kind of a reflection on the impossibility to commemorate, right? And I think your reference to the bones and the disintegration of the bones is a reference to that. Do you want to say a little bit more about how and in what ways your exhibition is or is not a reflection on the impossibility to commemorate? That this also introduces this idea of ephemerality into our conversation as well, right? So and an extended question, an added question to that would be, if it is impossible to commemorate, especially commemorate the dead, is it a worthwhile enterprise? Or under what conditions can it be a worthwhile enterprise to engage in the practice of commemoration?
So this is something me and you spoke about before, Dwayne, which is that like the relationship between the bones, like human remains or buried dead, and the tombstone, which is the thing that is like above ground, is like really this perfect illustration of the signifier and the signified, as in what actually creates meaning, you know, like you have the thing itself, the body, this corporeal thing, and then, but it's underground, you can't see it. And then you have the gravestone, which is the signifier, it's like the symbol. And we need both, right? Like we can't really make meaning without those two sides of what's it called? When you have a signifier and you have a signified, together they make something else. I don't know.
Significance, the practice of signification.
It's how we understand the world and how we make meaning, you know? So anyway, this is a little bit theoretical and not even something I'm like that deep into, but your question was about how do we commemorate, and what is, if it's even ever possible to really commemorate. And of course it's not. I mean, of course it's like you'll never like,
just to put it differently, it was like you're showing, the exhibition shows very poetically that the forms that we use to recall the dead and to commemorate the dead are ultimately subject to decay and deterioration. And that's it's difficult to, it's really difficult to accept that, because the function of commemoration, especially the commemoration of the dead, is to recall them long into the future, because we have very close attachments to the dead. But your exhibition foregrounds the ephemerality of the materials that we use for that commemoration, and the ultimate impossibility of it. So I'm saying, well, if it is impossible for us to commemorate it with any material form, then it also opens up the question of whether or not we should commemorate in the first place. Like, what a fleeting enterprise commemoration, the act of commemoration, is in and of itself.
Yeah. And I think that's what stone, or like working with stone, does, is that it shows what fleeting timelines we have as humans anyway. Like it's that, you know, that kind of lithic time span, which makes a human life just look like a speck of dust, you know.
I was also struck by your evocation of Madeleine Fullard, and that's such a great metaphor of the tombstone and the body, right? Like as sign and signified. Like you go to the gravestone, you know that the person that you loved and knew perhaps is buried there, and you perform rituals of commemoration by holding this person in your mind, and a moment of silence, whatever ritual obtains in your repertoire of commemoration. But Madeleine Fullard's text is unsettling because in her work with the missing person stars team, she frequently highlights how that is just not the case, that they go in search of missing persons with archival records as well as testimony from people who work in cemeteries, and they search for the bodies. The wrong bodies are buried in the sites that are marked in these archival records. So the relationship between sign and signified is broken there. So I was like, how do you think about that? Like in cases like that, where not only is commemoration itself a fleeting and impossible enterprise, but what happens under conditions where a relationship between sign and signified is broken in a commemorative act?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm going to just answer it by like, it's just something else that came to mind. And maybe this will like this will make sense somehow. But like, I was listening to a talk, and I'm going to just take a moment to find the name of the person who told the story. It was like a Zoom webinar. Oh, okay, yeah. And there was a woman named Vernelda Grant, and she's a tribal historic preservation officer of the San Carlos Apache tribe in Arizona. And so she does work with museums who hold the objects of the indigenous people of North America. And she was speaking about this one encounter that she had with, it's like a crown that was used in ritual ceremonies, and it's made out of plant matter, like eagle, and also plant and animal matter. So it's like eagle feathers and other plant materials. And part of the rituals in which this particular object was used traditionally was that after it gets used, it gets buried in the ground, and then the materials start to disintegrate and essentially feed the earth. And that's part of the process. And so the way that she experienced seeing this object in the museum was that part of its life had been kind of cut short by being placed in the museum. And so the act, in a way, of conservation, or not allowing the object to disintegrate, was in itself a kind of something that it stopped. It's like the continuation of its life, like its life, part of its life was also being able to disintegrate. And so I was wondering, I was thinking about that in relation to the bones that are then exhumed in the Mamelodi Cemetery. And it's very complicated, and I wouldn't want to do any kind of making equivalences between objects and human remains. But I do think that I don't necessarily want to come to any easy conclusions about any of the processes that we're talking about. But I think that there's something about it, like interruption of the life cycle, and maybe even death cycle. But in the case of the bones that were buried in Mamelodi, or the people who were buried in Mamelodi, the act of exhumation is also an act of commemoration. And I think that I'm also really interested in that, as in the fact that it's not about, you know, making a tombstone or having some kind of heavy object that seems permanent. It's actually relational, and it's also incomplete because it's happening 60 years after the death of these of the people. So yeah, I guess I'm just interested in the kinds of like things that opens up, and I think it I don't also like purport to have come to any conclusions about how we should memorialize, or in what would be like the right way of memorializing or something like that. I mean, there have been, you know, James Young writes about counter memorials, which are like memorials to the Holocaust that kind of somehow disappeared. They went through a process of like they were like these sculptures that like sunk into the ground. So people have dealt with this topic in different ways. Yeah. Maybe we can get some questions from
I think from the audience.
Yeah.
I think I'll open up shortly. I definitely will open up shortly. We still have about half an hour left. But the one thing that struck me about your comment was an emphasis on flows and relationality rather than permanence, and that it's about commemorations about the relationships that materials evoke, and the cycles that they flow through. Reminds me of the work on death by the Stanford anthropologist Eva Domanska, and when I heard Eva Domanska speak, it was really challenging to think that he made the proposition that, well, in a kind of ANT ontology, we never really die. Like you don't die. Like your life doesn't end. You merely transition into your necro life, and your remains disintegrate and become incorporated into other cycles and other flows. So I thought that was something that was percolating in your exhibition, and in the way that you were thinking about this.
Yeah.
Especially the ontologies that you're trying to evoke, ontologies of materiality and transformation especially of the human, and transformations of how we should think about the human. However, there is a kind of invocation of the aesthetic here that is compelling, but also I'm trying to think about the relationship between the aesthetics of the ontologies that you're trying to evoke through ruin and decay. I mean, the idea of the ruin is also, it comes from the Romantic period. It's a Western concept about the of buildings and the charisma of these buildings as being having kind of representation of a past that is no longer here anymore. So it's a very aesthetic concept. I think decay also has those kinds of connotations. And when we use these terms, it allows us to also perhaps sidestep some of the politics that come with the matter that we're actually dealing with. And I think that your exhibition is dealing with some sensitive political matter in terms of the human remains, the textual remains of the records of these poors, gravestones also. You're using marble to evoke the gravestones of a grave of a cemetery in Berlin. So, do you want to say a little bit more about that implicit tension there of the aesthetic and the politics that's percolating in your exhibition? Because if you do want to make the conceptual leap to other examples of restitution more generally, then I think addressing the politics that percolates in your very concrete case studies that out of which the exhibition arises could be helpful. And maybe you want to say something a little bit about the politics that's percolating in the exhibition, and then we can open up for questions from the floor.
Sure. I think it's something that I addressed briefly in the beginning when I spoke about what does it do to kind of, for example, use the shapes of the disintegrating pages of the Mamelodi cemetery, but not the names of the people who are buried there, you know, and again, and it's like there's many layers of like remove. So, you know, I'm trying to talk about the bones, but I'm not actually using the bones. I'm using the shapes of the pages that are the archive that record those bones. Like it's really, you're right, it's a very aestheticized like move. And even when it came to the point of like publishing the catalog, there was like a bunch of, like we were talking a lot about whether we could publish the names that are recorded in the cemetery archives. And they're not, when I say it's like, I mean, on one hand, yes, this is a normal cemetery where those records are public. But at the same time, we also know that Mamelodi is a township of Pretoria. It's a place where like the ordinary people whose lives were subject to the subjugation of apartheid are buried. It's not neutral either, you know, in the way that space and land and where people live is not a neutral thing in South Africa or anywhere. So what does it do to like completely aestheticize this thing, take away the names, and then basically if someone were to walk into that exhibition and not, there was some kind of ephemera that had some more like photos and background, kind of like what I showed at the beginning. But it was really up to the viewers how much they wanted to engage with that material. And I think it's just, again, it's like, it's one way of approaching this historical, political material. It's not the only way, but it was one way that I came to feel like I was able to speak into it, you know. And it is yeah, it's not, it's again, like it's not that I stand by, like, I mean, I stand by it, but I also realize why it is problematic potentially at the same time. And yeah, I mean, but it's also, whenever you're making an exhibition or whenever you're making a piece of work, you're dealing with the subject matter itself, but you're also proposing a way of engaging with that subject matter. And this is another, so I'm kind of making a proposal through that act of how I engage. And yeah, I mean, I would be really interested to hear about, like, from the other people in the room, what their experiences or reflections are.
Thanks, Talia. I think the exhibition is a fantastic proposal of the complexities of politics and aesthetics and these juxtapositions of ontologies and materialities. It's very rich, and it's theoretically it's asking hard questions, really hard questions. So now I want to open up to the floor. We have not seen comments coming in the chat box. Please raise your hand if you have a question. If you have a question about the exhibition or Talia's work generally. I'm pretty sure that there are post-preservation perhaps. I see a hand up. I'll take Sonia and then I'll take Nikita.
Oh, I think you have to turn your camera on. Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for that presentation. I just have a quick question. There's something that I missed and I want you to please repeat it. When you spoke about being a white woman and doing this type of work, I kind of missed the explanation that you gave. Could you please repeat that for me so that I can just understand the context and the positionality that, yeah, thank you.
Sure. Dwayne, do you want to take a round of questions or should I just answer as we go? I can't hear you. I think you're muted.
Yeah, I was muted for a second. Apologies. I'll take Nikita's question as well. And then...
Hi, thank you for that, Talia. I guess my question is a simple one. I want to know, how do you, in your work, in your practice, how do you navigate the heaviness that is associated and surrounding the objects and the narrative around the objects that you are working with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna start with the first question. So the first question is how I position myself as a white person making this work. And I think it actually connects to what we were talking about in the beginning, and it's actually like something that I think I've developed over some time in making in my practice, where I found that in a way, like using elemental materials, let's say. So in this exhibition, I used stone, but in other exhibitions, I've used sand and ash and water and or like evocations of water. And I was interested in using those materials because they seem to be like really open signifiers. Because they're universal, there's so much meaning that they already contain. And I found that it was really productive to use those materials to make meaning in the work. And just to say that it's not a settled kind of, like the day after I made this exhibition, I woke up and I was like, what have I done? Why me? Why am I here in Berlin telling this story? Like, what is that? And I go between different levels of comfort around doing it, but it's really what I spoke about in the beginning, is that the way I see my positionality is being able to, in some way, use and even saying use the stories is like a little bit already problematic, because it's someone's life, it's people's realities. But as an artist, being able to make metaphors and make meaning that do relate to the specific event, but also can be expanded outwards and have meaning beyond that event. And that's, for me, where I see my practice being. But I definitely don't think that it should be an easy way out of the politics of what's actually going on in the story, in the very fraught and like very heavy itself. And that's what Nikita was alluding to, is that it is a very heavy subject. And, you know, when I was in conversation with people about this, about the exhibition and about the work to start with, I was like, you know, who am I to tell this, to tell the story? But at the same time, being a white South African, it's also my story, because my life is also, has also been made through that. Like, I've also benefited from that violence, you know, so it's about finding where I feel that where I can make meaning out of these things, and it's not the only meaning. And that's also why I'm not trying to tell the stories of the people whose lives, the you know, the relatives of those who've been buried in the cemetery. I can't begin to tell their story, like, but I've found a way of positioning myself in which I can make a set of proposals around where I think there can be meaning to be found in this story. And to answer the question of heaviness and how do I navigate that, I think just allowing for those, trying not to skip over the heavy parts and trying to make that heaviness present. And I think from what I can tell from what people have said about their experiences of being in the exhibition, especially because it was being shown to an audience who are coming from different contexts, is that people somehow relate to that feeling of heaviness, and within their own stories, their own histories, their own contexts. And I guess that's the value in trying to share this work. So I don't know if I answered the questions very well, but I think I see some questions in the chat.
Yeah, there are some comments and follow-ups with Nikita. Nikita saying, I think Nikita is asking a question about space. To add to Azola's question, do you think that if you were not doing the work you're doing, someone else would be doing it instead? By someone, I mean a Black woman, for example, or even someone whose history is related to the material that you're busy working with. And then Kim also has a question, but I'll ask Kim to come up on screen to articulate the question immediately after this. But since it is a follow-up question by Nikita, what do you think about that? Do you think did you feel like you were occupying space, that you were taking space? Is it your place to be working with the materials from the Mamelodi Cemetery? Like,
yeah.
like when should we, like, when do we know that, like, even if we can say something, that we should say something, that we should comment on observations that we have?
Yeah, it's a good question. And look, I wouldn't have done the work if I didn't think that I had something to say about it. Do I think? I know. I mean, I would want, like, the stories of Black women, of people whose lives may have been more directly in contact with this kind of story. Of course, like, those are the voices that need to be heard and seen. And you know, and it's also it's a bit weird. I don't know if weird is the most like political term, but I mean, I made this work while on a residency in Berlin, and you know, there's a whole lot of privilege that goes into being able to do that kind of thing. But do I think it's taking space away from other people? Not necessarily, but I would be interested to hear who was it that wrote the question, Nikita? If you think it is, I mean, I'm very much like open to hearing, to understanding if, you know, if that's a proposition you're putting forward. And then, I mean, I'm just now that I have the chat open, I can see. Or Nikita, do you want to respond to that before I move on?
I'm actually interested to give the floor to some of my colleagues to perhaps respond, just because I raised the question, the point. If that's friendly with the House.
Sure, fine with me.
Thanks, Nikita. And then we'll hold this question, but then we can possibly come back to it. Kim, you have a question also. Do you want to come up on screen and pose a question?
Hi, Talia. Good to see you.
Hi, Kim. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks. Yeah, I think you did actually start to speak about this in your previous response. It was just about the kinds of, you know, how the exhibition resonated in Berlin. Maybe there's some specific examples you want to give of that. You know, in where the trajectories kind of went when you actually put the work out into the world that might have been unexpected or unforeseen, and kind of added to your own consideration of the work. And yeah, when I was thinking about it now, I was also just recalling your earlier words another time about multi-directional memory and that sort of thing, and maybe that sort of comes into this topic as well.
Yeah. So it's like, it's not something that I ever put out there in any official way, but you know, obviously what was also going on in the background for me, what being in Berlin, was my family history. My grandparents were both refugees of Nazi Germany and came to South Africa, and obviously became white, and you know, benefited from the privilege of being white in South Africa. And I've made work reflecting on that also, but there is this like specter of the commemoration of the Holocaust in Berlin, and for better or for worse, and oftentimes I think for worse, it comes to be the reference point from which everything else is read. So it's given this kind of centrality where the experiences of not only Jews, but it's often referred to as Jews in the Holocaust, is like the reference point of like the epitome of suffering and trauma in the world. And coming from South Africa, we understand that colonialism and slavery and you know, these processes, these things that had been going on before the Holocaust actually set up the conditions for that to happen. And I think it's now there is more public discussion around that topic, but unfortunately, I don't think that it's still quite a controversial thing in Germany to say that the Holocaust was not an exceptional event. So there is a lot of work being done to try and like destabilize it as that. but it still occupies that space, and unfortunately then gets used in very nefarious ways. And we've seen it recently in the way that, for example, like pro-Palestine, like activists or, you know, Palestinian solidarity movements are crushed or are suppressed by the German state because of these claims of anti-Semitism, for example. And it has nothing to do with them caring about Jews. It has much more to do with them using that history as a political tool, as a weapon in their own agenda. So this is, yeah, I mean, I do think that's like the lurking thing in the background, but something which I was like, I don't know how to bring this in fully into when I was making that specific exhibition, because there was so much already to talk about. But coming next, like next installation, my next project is actually addressing those themes more directly. And it's, yeah, I mean, it's also, I'm also going to be working with stones. I'm going to be working in the next few months at a memorial site for a concentration camp in the south of Germany, which was built at the site of a granite quarry. So using the stones in a way to try and talk again about permanence, but in the case of Germany, I would say that this insistence on a permanent way of commemorating the Holocaust is becoming quite violent towards in the way that it silences other histories of racial violence, and also in the way that it is used to silence migrants and people of color within Germany at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks, Talia, and thanks for explaining giving us a little bit of insight into your new work, how it builds on things that you're thinking about in Marble Dust. Marble Dust is so compelling for me because of the intricate ways in which you interwove these two histories together. I mean, it's German stone that you carved in the shape of sheets of paper from paupers' graves in South Africa. Implicit in the exhibition, while you didn't explore it explicitly, implicit is these parallels between deaths in different places, and how we can think about juxtaposition between South Africa, Africa more generally, Germany, and the African continent. Today is a very significant day in Germany also, and it's worth noting of the German state today that they finally acknowledged the German genocide, the genocide of the Nama and the Herero people. It was a historic occasion where an apology was made, as well as a package of reparations was announced. And it comes after years and years of activism. And I think at the same time that your exhibition was going on, and in the last 2 years or so, we've also seen this interesting and problematic conflation of post-colonial discourse with anti-Semitism. And I think it all started with the kind of attacks on Achille Mbembe being able to speak at a conference in the Ruhr Valley last year. And it was a huge scandal where Achille's work was thoroughly fine-combed for references that equated apartheid with the Holocaust. And subsequent to that, you see in public discourse, conservative voices trying to suggest that that post-colonial critique of museums and colonial legacies in general is somehow anti-Semitic in some way. I found that, yeah, that was really a strange and very problematic instrumentalization of a set of discourses. And I think your exhibition, while it didn't face any of that front on, it imputes it in ways that opens up questions for thinking about juxtaposition without comparison or relativizing. I think that's what strikes me about the exhibition. And can you tell us about like the kinds of things you're conceptualizing for your new exhibition? Are you going to be building a monument at least the height of the Fansian tomb? Because if you didn't, I'd be very disappointed.
Dwayne, you're gonna have to come and help me out. Like, can't do it myself. But no, so at the moment, so I've kind of been interested in the fact that in this area where I'm going to be working in the south of Germany, is the stones there, the granite stones, are actually made from cooled lava. You know, they used to be volcanoes, those mountains. Maybe they still are, I don't know, whatever, volcanic rock, let's say. And I was just interested in using the stones and making them into something that resembled lava or something that could flow and look like liquid. So I'm trying to see if I can grind the stones into sand and use the sand to make glass sculptures that look like kind of flowing lava. And yeah, I mean, it's about, I mean, I guess again, this is like a highly aestheticized, like super abstract way of saying what I want to say, which is the fact that these kind of ossified ways of memorialization, which is the thing that I was, which is what I was speaking against, about the ways in which the memories of the Holocaust are being instrumentalized in really, really problematic ways. Trying to talk about like breaking that, like taking that stone and making it again into something that moves and is liquid, and it's a very metaphorical way of doing it. And I again, like, I haven't really started making the work, so I don't know. And I'm gonna hopefully try and find ways to make it a little bit more direct in what I'm trying to say. But again, I mean, yeah, like I'm also trying to work with the qualities of the materials that I have available to me, and it's these specific kinds of granite, like that specific granite that is in that region, which is the reason why that concentration camp was built there in the first place, as a way to use the prisoners' labor for extraction, which is also completely connected to colonial practices. Yeah, Flick, trying to make everything connected somehow. Yeah.
Thanks, Larissa. So moving from something concrete to something that's to a medium and a substance that's flowing and in motion. We have a question from Shishle, who's using Sonia's channel. Everybody's asking questions from Sonia's. You want to come up on screen?
Hi, Talia. I just want to start off by thanking you for your contribution today and for sharing your research. It's got me thinking about a lot of the ways in which we kind of memorialize and commemorate people and things in South Africa. And it specifically raised a curiosity for me around the Tal Monument in Paarl, which is a memorial to the language, the Afrikaans language, to something that's very much alive. I think it was completed in 1975, and then the following year was the Soweto uprisings, kind of children protesting against the imposition of the Afrikaans language as kind of a tool for studying. And I wanted to know how you feel about, or if you've ever considered monuments to things that are still alive, and especially kind of like in parallel to your project in Mamelodi, because the stones I think that you're looking at are from 1960 to 1980, which were kind of like a hugely politically sensitive time in South Africa as well, and then also kind of parallels to the Tau monument being built in Paarl. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. But wait, don't go away. I have another question for you.
Okay.
Who built that monument? I don't know about it. What?
It's a bunch of Afrikaans dudes who,
Yeah.
who built it kind of to mark or to celebrate 100 years of the language in South Africa. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this something we didn't really get into, but this work is also made in the background or in the foreground of Rose Must Fall, of not only in South Africa, but throughout the, the US and the UK, these, real political movements being centered around monuments. So I don't know if I have anything more to say than what is already like out there, in the sense that like these are obvious points of political movement, because they're something that's like physically taking up like space in the public realm, and it's very useful to have an object onto which to kind of like make these very important political moves. It sounds like, I'm going to go and Google this monument afterwards. I've never heard of it. It sounds really interesting. And it sounds like a similar, like it was made within a similar vein to these, there was in 1985, the centenary, or I guess 150 years, I don't know, of the Great Trek, and this big, I don't know, this big group of Afrikaans nationalists.
Yeah, so the Tau monument was unveiled in 1975, and it celebrates the Afrikaans language, but a very Afrikaans, and it's up in Paarl, and it's this gargantuan monument on a hill that you can see from all around. And
yeah,
I think they're trying to reinvigorate the monument by including other kinds of Afrikaans at that monument. But I think it's a valid question. And this is also a remark for all the students who want to invoke monuments. If you don't know the full history of the monument, don't introduce it as an example.
No, that's not true, Dwayne. That's totally, no, we can talk about things anyway.
Yeah,
it's all good.
I'm teasing. But
yeah.
I think we have one last question or comment from Cindy Lee. Basel in Switzerland. Afternoon, Cindy Lee, welcome.
Hi. I actually don't have a question. I have a compliment. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed your catalog for Marble Dust, and I think the combination of the literary response and the analytical framework was fantastic. I found it quite meditative, which really surprised me, and I look forward to the next.
thank you. That's so nice to hear. The poems were written by a very brilliant South African poet named Sarah Gotzel, and I was really moved by both her interpretation as well as the essay that was written by a friend and colleague in Berlin, Nina, who I was really touched by both of their contributions. So like, thank you. I think we had a comment in the chat from Cynthia.
I did not see.
It was directly to me. Okay, so then maybe I'll just like answer it privately, maybe. I don't know if Cynthia is still on the call. Do you want to say something, or should we chat and we can chat separately?
Hi, Talia. No, I mean, there are so many things you could say about your wonderful presentation, but I was just coincidentally last night, I was reading, as I said to you in my comment, the Times Literary Supplement, and they were going on about this prayer book that dates from 1536. And it belonged at one stage to Anne Boleyn. And the myth is that she gave it into someone's keeping as she was walking off to get her head chopped off. And it's lasted for more than 400 years. And it has an inscription by her, a rhyming couplet. But what they were excited about in the TLS was that they had discovered that there were other inscriptions by the family who came to own it. That they had obviously rubbed out because they were scared of what Henry VIII would do to them if his people found something that had belonged to Anne Boleyn in their possession, because he strictly forbade anything to do with her to be possessed by her. And it just struck me, we're talking about things that have barely lasted for 30 years. And then here's this document that's been carefully preserved and cherished in England that's, from 1536. And I just get sort of worried about how quickly things here are allowed to decay. And I found those pictures that you showed of the cemetery register very, very upsetting. I have to imagine if you were a relative who had lost someone in terrible circumstances that you described, and then you had to go and see that mess, and you try to find out where their grave could be, then compared to this, I presume because there's so many resources that can save this document, and you have to ask, what is its actual historical importance in the grand scale of things as well? So I just have all these kinds of thoughts.
And I think that can be kind of an irritation for people who work within the archive and museum heritage sector, in not only an irritation, but a deep worry for people who work in the sector in South Africa. And I mean, Cynthia, you might remember, I don't know, but my master's thesis was about messy archives, and there was a little bit of a kind of contention, because as I'm saying, I'm kind of making a similar argument here, where I'm saying the mess, or in this case, the disintegration, is also another point from which to make meaning. And that's all very well when you're like an artist and you get to make metaphors about stuff, but it doesn't really hold when it comes to people, first of all, who are looking for, their family members and need information. And second of all, whose job it is to actually work with these archives. And I think that I've also never really come up with a way of dealing with that tension. But I also, if I'm going to have the luxury of working with this material as an artist, I'm also afforded the luxury of not having to deal with those daily, like very urgent concerns. And I'm so grateful that Madeleine and her team do that. I mean, they do the most amazing work. And the reason I even came into contact with these documents in the first place was that I was helping the Missing Persons Task Team to take photos so that they had a digital record, because they were like so scared of losing what is already a diminished archive. So on one, I I think you get what I'm saying, but the point about resources and stuff also comes to bear on what I was talking about with the centrality of Holocaust memorialization, and that's something we also have to bear in mind, is that what amount of resources and access is given to which histories also is very much indicative of the power structures of the current moment.
Awesome. Thanks, Talia. And we're running a little bit over time. It's Friday afternoon after a long week, a long month. But I mean, you've given us so much to think with. We didn't even get into a conversation about the loss of the library, the rush to preserve the materials. What are the implications of post-preservation for thinking about that?
Yeah.
Just let everything decay. How much should be left to decay? How much should be preserved? How do we embark on that? When is preservation an act of destruction? There are many, many, many questions that build up from that. So still so much to think with. Thank you, Talia, for beaming in today. Thank you for sharing with us about your exhibition. It was wonderful to think with you today. We will add more links and references to some of the references that you made on the page that will be published associated with your Spirals talk. So thank you so much for that. I also want to alert you to our next session on the 25th of June. We'll be hosting Dr. Luisa Prado Omartins. She's an artist and scholar based in Berlin, and she's written a wonderful series on the colonial histories of color. She's exploring elemental colors as well as vegetal colors and their colonial histories, and she will talk to us about a series that she's written for Futures magazine. You can see the link. I've dropped it in the chat box over there if you want to see some of the articles that she's written so far. I think the next one she's going to be working on, she suggested, was going to be gold to talk about, and much to think with coming up for that session. Talia, please, you are most welcome to join us for that session as well. And many, many thanks. And many thanks to all our guests who joined us here this afternoon. Please do stay safe.
Thanks, Dwayne, and thanks everyone for coming and engaging. It was really nice to chat to all of you.